When Richard Nixon made his first and only trip to Vietnam as president, he visited U.S. troops 12 miles outside the South Vietnamese capital to make a point.
Partly to emphasize that security has improved, not only in Saigon, but outside the capital as well.
General Creighton Abrams had taken over the Vietnam command before the 1968 election. Abrams replaced the failed search and destroy approach of his predecessor with clear and hold tactics aimed at securing the population from communist forces. During Nixon's first year in office, the news media reported greatly improved security conditions in South Vietnam. Journalists noted with obvious pleasure that they could drive in parts of the country where previously they'd been shot at. But as historian Louis Sorley wrote in A Better War, the U.S. military command recognized that security improvements wouldn't last if the North Vietnamese army remained in the South while the U.S. Army withdrew.
Under the new orders, the primary mission of our troops is to enable the South Vietnamese forces to assume the full responsibility for the security of South Vietnam. After 5 years of Americans going into Vietnam, we are finally bringing American men home.
Nixon promised to end the war through Vietnamization or negotiation. Vietnamization was supposed to train and equip the South to defend itself. We would stand down, the president promised, only when Saigon could stand up to the communists.
As South Vietnamese forces become stronger, the rate of American withdrawal can become greater.
Negotiations, Nixon said, were aimed at securing the North's agreement to free elections in the South.
We have declared that anything is negotiable, except the right of the people of South Vietnam to determine their own future.
The president promised to bring the troops home only when South Vietnam could defend and govern itself, and not before.
For the South Vietnamese, our precipitate withdrawal would inevitably allow the communists to repeat the massacres which followed their takeover in the North 15 years before.
The president called for national unity, but he also subtly suggested that those who didn't support him would bear the blame if he failed to fulfill his campaign pledge to end the war and win the peace.
The more support I can have from the American people, the sooner that pledge can be redeemed. For the more divided we are at home, the less likely the enemy is to negotiate at Paris. Let us be united for peace. Let us also be united against defeat. Because let us understand, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that.
Eventually, Richard Nixon did find a way to win overwhelming popular support, but he still couldn't find a way to win the war. 3 years later, Nixon announced the bombing and mining on a very interesting date. Remember the secret Republican poll that said Americans would support bombing and blockading the North for 6 months? The date of Nixon's television speech, May 8, 1972, was 6 months minus 1 day before the election. Nixon publicly presented the bombing and mining as decisive action to end the war, and privately reacted with fury to military criticism.
I'm not going to fill in all the chips and then have a half-assed command structure that doesn't have confidence. So we've got to get Abrams out there. I've got to get him out.
The president decided to pull Abrams out of Vietnam by kicking him upstairs to Army Chief of Staff. Nixon considered creating a supreme Allied commander for Vietnam, Admiral John McCain, Jr., who as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command was already Abrams' superior officer.
I have more confidence in the Admiral than I have in Abrams, basically. I think the Admiral, actually, he's got a son in the field, doesn't he? That he is a hard-line little son of a bitch. Now, the little Admiral, do you have confidence in him? You don't. Not much. I don't have much confidence in him. Great. His heart is great.
The president, however, quickly soured on McCain when Vice President Spiro Agnew told him that the admiral had complained to him of bombing restrictions, a complaint that could damage Nixon with his base on the political right, which claimed that civilian restrictions on the military had kept us from winning the war. The president summoned Admiral Thomas Moore, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to dress him down.
You know, and I've ordered that goddamn Air Force time and again to do anything, and they can't bomb because they say it's 4,000 to 4,000 foot ceiling. You know and I know that they do not have restrictions. The only restriction they've got is the one with 10 miles of Hanoi at the present time, which they didn't have before, and the Air Force didn't do a goddamn
North Vietnam's capital was temporarily off limits to American bombers because the president was headed toward a summit with the Soviets and wanted to make sure he didn't accidentally bomb their embassy in Hanoi while he was their guest in Moscow. While Nixon took credit for defying warnings that the bombing and mining might lead the Soviets to cancel the summit, he and Kissinger had realized in the invasion's first week that Moscow needed the summit as much as they.
Still want to drive a hard bargain to summit. Oh, they want that summit.
Mr. President, they can no more afford to not have that summit.
They can't trade Vietnam for this.
During the Moscow summit, while American air power in Vietnam was dashing the communists' hopes for immediate victory, Nixon and Kissinger were raising the communists' hopes for victory following a so-called decent interval. During one closed-door discussion, Soviet General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev said, "Dr. Kissinger told me that if there was a peaceful settlement in Vietnam, you would be agreeable to the Vietnamese doing whatever they want, having what they want after a period of time, say 18 months. If that is indeed true, and if the Vietnamese knew this and it was true, they would be sympathetic on that basis. Even from the point of view of the election in the United States, I submit that the end of the war at this particular time would play a positive role, whereas escalation will not." Brezhnev was mistaken about the bombing's political impact. Poll after poll showed large majorities backing Nixon's attacks on Hanoi and Haiphong, just as the secret poll 3 years earlier indicated. Nixon had positioned himself masterfully. If the North Vietnamese accepted a peace settlement, knowing they could cast it aside and overthrow the South Vietnamese government so long as they waited a so-called decent interval, Nixon could make the campaign rhetoric of a generation of Republican politicians sound plausible. It would look as if a Republican president, having finally cast off the restraints on the use of American military power, had actually won the Vietnam War. But it would be an illusion. When he ordered the bombing and mining, Nixon said that to do otherwise would leave the South Vietnamese to a long night of terror. But a decent interval deal was not going to prevent a South Vietnamese massacre, just postpone it, until after his settlement had removed American troops, without providing means for the South Vietnamese who had fought on our side to escape the communist takeover. The president had set the stage so he could play the part of the hero, using human lives, American and Vietnamese, as props. During the months following the invasion, Nixon instructed the White House PR apparatus to get across what he called the basics about the man: strong, courageous, intelligent, patriotic, country first, politics second. Next, Nixon's secret diplomatic efforts bear fruit as the Chinese warm to a decent interval deal.